Like movies with plenty of action and suspense, spy thrillers are meant to be entertaining. They're an escape from the routines of everyday life, but they also remind us the world's a dangerous place and that things aren't always what they seem in the early chapters. That certainly applies to a new book called The Sovereign, the second in a series of books centered around the Andalusian agent and former police officer Amir Duran. We'd like to welcome the author, who also works for the American Civil Liberties Union in Massachusetts, John Ward. Thank you very much for being with us, John.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it.
John, we report on what the ACLU works with, things having to do with the dangerous world sometimes as well.
It's true.
But what's the common denominator between that and what you write about in these books?
Sure. I mean, I think the obvious common denominator is the difficulty of people's lives in difficult circumstances. Obviously, ACLU both litigates and advocates for a bunch of people who often have had their civil rights and civil liberties stripped from them. In my books, they take place in the future. It's a dystopian environment, it's a dystopian world. Much of it is set in Europe. And the population has experienced a massive collapse. As a result, what I'd call a totalitarian government has taken over in these sort of outlets, these different places throughout Europe. The protagonist is a cop who ends up becoming a spy in Granada, Spain. And Granada is much more like what I'd compare sort of a medieval or even a Roman colony. It's a walled city now. The British rule it. And the class structure is incredibly stratified. There's the British who rule it. There are the natives who are there. And there are waves of immigration that have affected the population in the city. And in some ways, the work that we're experiencing at ACLU now has a certain parallel to that. As you know, there's an immigration crisis going on in this country. As you know, we have a president in charge who is hell-bent on kicking as many people out of this country as possible. And people have gone through tremendous hardship as a result. I think those themes are really apparent in this book. And the main character is sort of sorting through morally, how do you deal with your responsibilities to the state that you work for the country that you work for, without abandoning your own personal moral beliefs. So I think it's all there. It plays out differently, of course, because it's fiction and there's a lot of shoot 'em up action in the story, but I think it's all there.
Well, the central character in these books, his name is Amir Duran. He lives
right.
in El Albaicin, which is the old Moorish quarter.
Right. Have you ever been?
I've read about it, you know.
Yeah.
So tell us about him.
So Amir is a half Arab, half Spanish homicide cop. In the second book, he becomes a British spy. But he grew up in Granada, was a young child when the Red Death hit, a sort of a plague. I think of it as an airborne Ebola, though it's never made explicit what it is. And when it hits, the British invade. And he kind of goes through an identity crisis as an adult, because he's looking back at this life that he's had, and he's lived entirely in this walled city. And he's experienced things as sort of a refugee in his own city. He's never lived in another time except for under the British yoke and under the British rule, and he's tried to sort of, through his hardscrabble existence, cut out a life for himself and his family. And he's dedicated to really preserving the peace in this city that is forever at odds with itself. Lots of crime, as I said, a stratified social and economic culture. The African immigrants are outside the wall and farming the fields outside. The Muslim immigrants are just inside the wall and living in destitute poverty. And then there's the wealthy Spanish and the landed elite who are inside, all of it ruled by the British. And Amir sort of internally represents many of those stratifications. He's both Arab and Spanish, and he's kind of a tough guy, but sensitive to the history of his own people. And so he makes his way in the world. He eventually goes to work for the British because he's so good at what he does, and they think he could be useful. In the second book, he's actually sent to go find a young boy abroad who the British believe holds the secret, or at least the potential for a cure for this disease. So for the first time, he's propelled into the outer world that he's never experienced, and with it comes incredible amount of struggle and surprises and sort of self-growth, actually, as it goes on.
This is being in the news, and we're talking with John Ward, author of The Sovereign. John, I guess what makes him interesting as a character is he's sort of conflicted. He wants to be good at what he's paid to do.
That's right.
But he doesn't want to be just a mercenary. So how does he keep himself centered?
It's hard. I mean, Amir, I think part of it is his faith. He was raised to be faithful in the Muslim religion, in Islam, but he does it on his own terms, like he does many things. His grandfather, his Jeddo, was a strong influence in his life. Amir didn't grow up with a father, and his mother's father raised him in the faith and always taught him to be faithful and be good to people. Throughout the book, we sort of have the visitation of these memories of Jeddo. It's kind of like I was describing it during my book release party to the interviewer as sort of a Yoda character. And Jeddo visits him through memory and also through dream, and it helps guide him morally when he confronts a difficult decision, when he has to make a difficult life and death decision. Often he sort of thinks to himself, "What would Jeddo do?" So that's a way of guiding himself. But I think deep in Amir is this sense of justice and this sense of truth, and it defies, I'd say, his British overlords, and it defies the bad guys he might be facing on a daily basis.
You know, I like the states of the world that you describe in this book. You know, one description of Zanzibar, this island off the east coast of Africa, the sort of crumbling facade of advanced civilization and economy. You know, which makes me think of California and the Great Recession too.
Yeah.
But why is that so important in a book for you?
So I thought what was really interesting, that the world I tried to create was both recognizable and incredibly different. But in all the world, it's not a future where there are gadgets and there's technology, and the prevailing theme of it is sort of the advancing march of technology. What it is sort of the old world fading from the surface of the earth, humanity sort of being wiped away from history. In the places that he visits in Zanzibar, like Grenada, he recognizes the old colonial architecture. He recognizes the experience that this place too has been ruled by those who are not from it. And there's a theme in this book about different islands. There's a theme about the British and their colonial history. There's a theme about, the title itself is drawn, The Sovereign, about sovereignty and how you exercise it when you've lost control of your own life. So I thought some of that imagery around Zanzibar, some of the colonial history, some of the sort of the architectural history of the Arab traders, there's so many different layers of history, and that's such a big theme in both the first book and the second book, and ultimately the third one, which I've already written.
The other thing about spy thrillers, since a lot of the people who are going at each other are more or less spies, is the bureaucracy of it all and the secrecy. You follow orders, but you don't know what's going on. Have you encountered that elsewhere?
You know, it's interesting. At the ACLU, I never feel weighed down by a tremendous amount of bureaucracy. Obviously, I'm communications director. You should ask my staff.
I didn't think it was internal.
You should ask my staff what they think.
Right.
But sure, I think government by nature, when it gets large enough, can fall into sort of a bureaucratic rut in different agencies, right? I think the size of government really makes a difference. I think the difficulty in making change is real. Change often happens on an incremental basis in government. Certainly, I've experienced very slow progress in certain areas of government. I worked in government prior to working at the ACLU. I was working on a lot of criminal justice reform stuff. I was working on a lot of sort of substance abuse treatment stuff. You know, 2 steps forward often come with 1 step back, or they often come at the cost of a negotiation that's not always in the best interest of everybody, but is in the best interest of the majority of people. So I think all systems, all big systems, bureaucracy tends to weigh them down. I think that's hard for Amir in the book. He's kind of a maverick. He likes to do things like he likes to do things. I think it's hard for some of the other spies, even his antagonists that he's going up against. They're all sort of, they're a bit hamstrung by their superiors and by the systems that they're working for.
You mentioned you've already gone up to what, book number 3 now?
That's the last book in the series. It's sort of a loose trilogy. It's more of a series than it is a trilogy. The 3rd book's coming out next September, I believe. Okay. Hasn't been edited by my editor yet, though.
Okay, so if people want some more of this and how to get it, what's the best thing to do?
Yeah, so I think going online is the best thing. It's carried in some bookstores, small bookstores, but Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, iTunes, all of it. It's all available online. Google it. I have a website, johnward.inc, and that's with a K. But basically Google it. My name, John Ward, John, W-A-R-D, and then look up The Citadel or The Sovereign. You'll find it eventually. And leave a review.
Right. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate your time.
John Ward. We'll have more news in just a moment.